Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Vincent Reed. We've got a treat for you today. We're going to be joined by Dr. Lee Prosser, the curator of historic buildings at Historic Royal Palaces and also a leading expert in architecture and conservation of historic buildings. Now, Lee's research spans a wide range of fascinating topics, including the study of historic staircases, the development of timber framing and the technological advancements behind historic structures. He's also deeply passionate about vernacular architecture, the trade in historic building materials, and the history of interior decoration, particularly chinoiserie, historic wallpapers, and lighting. Lee has worked on numerous high-profile projects, including Kensington and Kew Palaces, as well as the restoration of the Great Pagoda at Kew. So it's going to be fantastic today. I first worked with Lee back in 2011 at in the King's State Apartments at Kensington Palace. So I really hope you enjoy today's episode. So Lee, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
Fantastic. So we first met, believe it or not, 14 years ago.
Really?
14 years ago at Kensington Palace at the King's Apartments. That was 2011, that first project. And I did the sums when I was driving down today to the studio, and I thought, my God, that's 14 years ago.
Yeah, time goes. I've done so many projects over the years, and it's hard. Well, some of them I can recall instantly, and others I have to be reminded about and think, oh yeah, I did that, didn't I?
Yeah, that did shock me today, finding out that. But yeah, but so let's start with. I'm really interested to find out, exactly what you do, your roles and responsibilities as a curator at Historic Royal Palaces. But could we just start by your background, how you got into this industry?
Well, I started life as an archaeologist, but I was never very fond of digging. I'm not a digger, and most people think that all archaeologists are like that. But in fact, what I was very interested in early on were landscapes and things like, for example, the origins and meanings of place names and why fields are shaped like they are, and the organization of the landscape into estates, and when churches first arrive, and all of those sort of permutations, land ownership and the development of manors. So I specialized in that, and I got a PhD in landscape archaeology with my supervisor was Mick Aston, who many people would know from the Time team. He's no longer with us, sadly, but he was a great inspiration. And when I was doing that, I had to look at buildings as well. But after I got my PhD, I worked for a while in commercial archaeology, and that was mostly doing background research for projects, desktop assessments, they call them. So I was looking in the archives and things like that. Sometimes I'd have to go out on site and do a bit of digging, but that was all right. And then at that time, they started to put requirements on planning permission for listed building recordings. So if you were altering a listed building, you needed to have a report done which explained and understood the building. So I started doing these. I said, oh, I'm quite interested in that. And I started working with a man called Adrian Gibson, who was a great specialist in timber framing and who was just a fantastic teacher and a mentor, really. And once I started doing that, I realized I'd found my niche, which was historic buildings. And I never looked back. So I did that for several years. And then I was also doing a bit of adult education teaching, all sorts of things like that. And then the job at Historic Royal Palaces came up and really dovetailed into the kind of things that I'd been doing. What they needed was somebody who understood historic buildings, who could inform the conservation of buildings. And I had all of that expertise at the time. But when I look back now, I realized that, I know so much more now. I'm so much more mature in my approach than I was 20 years ago.
But what you were actually doing and what you first did, it was fascinating. So the draw to get into buildings, you're already doing something very exciting in the first place.
I would never have thought that I would end up doing historic buildings, but it's one of those things where you find your niche, if you like. Somebody shows you something, and you if you've got an innate interest in things. And I would say that I'm a person who's very, very curious about everything. I want to understand about everything. When I was a kid, at Christmas, I was terrible because I'd take all my toys apart to see how they worked, and I'd break them, and it wasn't because I was destructive, but I wanted to see how they worked. And it's the same in a building. Building's no different. It's a kind of forensic examination of a building to try and get to the bottom of it, and let it make it reveal its secrets. And really, I suppose at the end of the day, I just found that niche that sparked really sparked an interest in buildings.
Did you think back then you probably underestimated how much there was to learn? You said 20 years ago your approach has changed vastly, and I've been doing this job for a long time, but I still I feel like an imposter and a novice because there's so much more to learn. There's so much to learn, isn't there?
I would, without being too immodest, I would say I did know a lot, but I've never stopped learning.
Yeah.
And sometimes I look back at projects that I did years ago and think, oh, why did I say that?
Yeah.
But I haven't made sort of howlers, if you like, but I would modify my approach now. And I think back to some projects that I didn't quite understand what I was looking at, maybe, decades ago. And I think, well, if I had the chance to go back then now, I would understand it. But that's what comes with experience, I think. There's no if you're not always learning, then you really shouldn't be in the job.
And also, I think that the approach is different now. We're very much more conservation based than we were. We used to be more restoration, didn't we? 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So it's that approach has definitely changed as well.
Yeah, there's a whole sort of side part of my job is understanding the buildings in order to understand their significance. So what's important, what's not important about a building. And on the other side is the technical expertise that you need to be able to know how to advise and to conserve them properly in a way that's appropriate for today. And that's a field that's really come on in leaps and bounds as well. The last 20-25 years. If you go back 40 years, I mean, it was shocking what people did to historic buildings.
Yeah.
Even with the best intentions, they still did things that we look back now and say, oh, you shouldn't have done that.
And what was it like getting your first job with HRP? And when was that actually, Lee? When did you start?
It was January 2003. So it is a long time ago now. I've been there for 22 years, just over 22 years. It was, I can't explain how I felt. I mean, it was an incredible sense of euphoria, and also I thought a great privilege to have been selected to work for an organization like that, such a prestigious organization. And I was instantly dropped into a project to restore Kew Palace. And I always feel like I sort of hit the ground running, and I don't ever feel like I wasn't up to the task, And I thought, no, they've picked the right person for this, what they wanted. And I've never stopped feeling that sense of privilege of having these incredible buildings, which are national treasures, and they're in my hands in a way, and I've got a big responsibility to bear for conserving and restoring and interpreting them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was your position when you first started?
We were assistant curators. So the organization had one curator, and then there were lots of assistant curators. And then at some stage we were all sort of bumped up to curator, if you like. So it's a kind of senior role now, but it's not. The job has changed a great deal. Partly because when I first started, HRP was a much smaller organization, so we did a lot more. So we used to do, we would do teaching, sometimes we would do lecturing, we would go on the television if we were needed. We did interpretation and exhibitions. But as the organization's grown and matured and become more sophisticated, we've become sort of more selective in the things that we do. So we focus much more on certainly from my role, much more on the historic buildings now than we ever did. We were jacks of all trades originally, but we don't need to do that anymore.
Okay. And if you had to explain to somebody what a curator does, sort of day-to-day responsibilities, what would you say?
We're we're the knowledge of the palaces. So everybody in that organization, if they're in the retail section, if they're in the maintenance section, or surveyors, or if they are in press, if they need to know anything about the palaces, we are the go-to, because
Mm.
we're perceived as having all the knowledge up in our heads. Or as we always say, if we don't know the answer, we know where to find it. So we're the knowledge, and as a result, when, for example, they want to do a repair, or a piece of a building falls down, they will come to us in the first instance, and we will do the research necessary to understand the building, or that part of the building, in order to inform the repair or the conservation.
So how closely do you work with architects then?
We work with architects. Normally, our projects, we'll have a project which might be an interpretation project, for example. So I could go right back to Kensington or to Kew, when we decided that we were going to reinterpret the palace, which meant opening more of it up to the public than previously, which meant making all sorts of modifications to make it more accessible, for example, level access, all those things which would have an impact into the historic fabric. Or maybe they
Mm.
wanted to hang pictures on the walls, which meant drilling holes in walls and things like that.
Yeah.
And for those projects, they will usually appoint an architect who sort of oversees it all. But we are still at the center of it, and making decisions. So we've got quite a lot of what I would call soft power, which means we're very influential. And we also liaise very closely with the inspectors from Historic England, because our palaces are all listed buildings. So ultimately, we still have to seek permission to do all of the things that we do from Historic England. So we're very important in sort of smoothing the way, if you like, and making sure that what is proposed, would be acceptable to Historic England, and then they
Mm.
can give us the permission to do things.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, as I said, Liz Smith was a guest on the show, and we were talking about adapting historic buildings, and
Mm,
that you can't just leave them as old relics, because they need to sometimes pay for their keep,
mm,
and they need to be functional. And when the last project we did at Kensington Palace, that was all the data cables and the services that were going in. So there was a lot of work, taking off panels and all sorts of things like that.
mm,
So it must be interesting. Your job must be fascinating, because it starts with an idea, right? We've got to do this.
mm,
And then how is that going to happen? How much damage is that going to cause? What do we need to sacrifice? Which is another big question,
mm.
isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
To make sure that the palace, has the visitor numbers and it pays for itself and such and such.
That's right. I've always been a pragmatist as well. I think I've known people who are very dogmatic about their approach to historic buildings, and don't want anything to happen to them. Absolutely nothing. That you just keep them in a position, keep them in a condition that they keep ticking over. But historic buildings, they have to live. They have to continue to function. They have to be relevant to the modern world. And so that you have to be pragmatic about finding ways around it. You don't always win that battle. There are things that have happened where I've agreed to a change based on a decision, such as, for example, is that new use or that adaptation going to be permanent? Will it be something that we'll do temporarily, or will it be forever? And if something's a permanent change, then often you'll agree to something maybe slightly more drastic than you would if it was a temporary thing. And
Yes.
then I've found out in 10 years down the road that they've sort of changed it again, and I feel in hindsight maybe we shouldn't have agreed to it. But what
Mm.
that does is it forearms you for the future, so you never get caught out like that twice.
Yes.
If
Interesting.
you ever feel like somebody was not upfront with you, or perhaps, well, I wouldn't quite say it's like that, but you anticipate the situation. So I'm less easily persuaded by things with hindsight and with more experience now,
Mm.
and that makes me a better curator, I think.
the amount that you have to learn and retain is quite, it's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got to know a lot about everything when it comes to buildings.
Mm,
You've got to understand. You've got to understand what you're looking at. I mean, you work in kind of you work in the carpentry and joinery field, and you can look at a piece of wood and you can understand it. You can see, you can diagnose the type of wood it is. We have to do that as well, and
mm.
I'll never forget. We had an architect who did a survey of our windows and said, "Oh, they're all pine." And I said, "I don't think they are. I think they're oak." Of course, I was right. But I thought, my goodness, that architect should have known the difference between
Yeah.
oak and pine. But of course, not everybody does. So you have to understand things like that, practical things like that, and then um, perhaps I mean, you mentioned that I have an interest in wallpapers. Well, you need to be able to look at a piece of wallpaper and be able roughly to date it, to say what date it is, because often they'll uncover things like that, and you have to be in a position to make an instant diagnosis on it, if you like.
Mm.
So yeah, we the amount of information you need to understand a building is absolutely huge and always growing.
Are you quite good at retaining information?
Yeah,
I
I,
bet you
I
are.
can't.
Yeah.
I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday morning, but I could. But I can tell you. I can tell you what a 14th century nail looks like.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that does help actually. I've got a very good memory for details, and very often I can do a bit of an analysis on a building. So if we've got a floorboard up, for example, I have a look round. Some people have to take notes all the time, but I can often go away, and a few days later I can just write it all up from my brain.
That's
Um,
incredible. My
yeah,
wife's like that.
yeah. It's not quite photographic, but I do have good recall in some respects, and that no doubt helps.
Yeah, my wife can sit in a board meeting and she will remember
Mm,
pretty much what everybody had said and all the comments and things. I said, how do you do that?
mm, mm.
That's a great asset, especially in your line of work.
And you can train yourself to do it as well.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think.
quite keen on that.
I don't think it's purely natural. I think you can train your brain to recall certain things. I always
I
find, for example, when I'm looking at a building, um, if you do a systematic study of it. So if I'm in an old barn, for example, the best way to understand that barn is to look at every single timber. But you go into an old building, people say, "Oh, what do you think? What do you think?" And you're like, "Well, I have to sort of stand here for 2 hours and look at every timber, and then I'll start to make the connections, if you like." But that's where perhaps the recall comes in.
yes. Yeah, because I've made that mistake in the past where I've come to a conclusion way too quickly.
Yeah,
Then you get caught out and think, that's
shouldn't have said that.
that's wrong because I've just discovered this. So
Yeah,
that's out the window. And you're right, you just literally have to take your time and spend a lot of time and look at everything, not just if you're going in to look at timbers, for instance, you can't just look at the timbers. You've got to look at all the surroundings and everything that's attached to the timbers, haven't you? And get all of your evidence and piece it
that's right.
together.
Yeah, I've always found old buildings because I still do other work as well around about. So I still involvement with the vernacular architecture group, for example, and occasionally I'll go and have a look at an old building for somebody. And what I find with old buildings is that a house or a barn or something like that, they start off as being a mystery, and by looking at them in great detail, they resolve themselves in your brain, and it's of course it's your brain doing the work, and then sometimes they kind of give up the secrets, and then you think, oh, of course that came before then, or of course this is the case. But you don't see that when you first go into the building. You really need to let them kind of absorb them and let them grow on you, and then
Mm.
you understand the problem and you can resolve it.
That takes a lot of years of looking, doesn't it? Yeah, I had Maggie Henderson, who's a historic buildings archaeologist.
Oh, I know Maggie.
You
Yes.
know Maggie, yeah,
Okay.
and I was saying to Maggie, look, buildings have just changed so much, so it's incredibly difficult for you to date various things. If one thing's, 200 years old, the next thing is 300 years old. They look very, very similar. And she was explaining that you just have to just piece it all together and find out all of your evidence. So that takes years. You cannot do that, can you? After a few years?
No, no. I mean, I can. If I look at people say to me, how do you know that that window is 1630 to 1650? You know, how do you know that? And I where do I learn that? Where can I read about that? And I said, there's no book that tells you this. The
Mm,
reason I know that is because I've seen 1,000 of them, and and I've been able to date them in context.
yeah.
So in a way, it's observation. It's not something that's really, you can't book learn that.
No.
It's just practical, going and looking and looking and looking and looking, and then storing it, and then eventually you can look at a door or a door handle or a piece of glass in a window, and you can begin to understand the date of those things.
Mm. How much time do you get as a curator to do your research and, read your books?
HRP, Historic Royal Palaces, is very enlightened in that respect, and they understand that we do we do really good projects, and very often we move on straight away to another project, and that means that we just park out all the research that we've done. But they understand that in order to understand a building, we need to go away and do research in the National Archives or wherever we need to do it, or to do measured drawings, also all sorts of things like that. And
Mm,
so I would say that we are allowed to a degree to do our own research and to write up our research, but it's never enough, really. I mean, obviously you could sort of do it endlessly, but it's one of the things I really love about HRP is that they appreciate the the value of knowledge and disseminating that knowledge to the wider world, not just sitting on it, keeping it to ourselves.
yeah. No, that's great. And it must be difficult for you when you start your research not to get carried away and think, oh, I could learn about this. And you've got to be focused on what you're
Oh,
doing. Otherwise, you'll
yeah.
spend
They're
whole
like rabbit
day.
holes. I mean, you go down
Yes.
rabbit holes. You're sitting in the National Archives, and you get some records up, and you think, "Oh, that's interesting," and off you go,
Yeah.
and you have to think, "No, no, come back. You're not researching that today." But
Yeah.
but yeah, it's good. And the other thing I'm allowed to do is that I've got a particular interest, for example, in roofs, as you know.
Ah, yeah.
Roofs really interest me, and we've got some fantastic roofs in our palaces. I mean, real corkers, and yet none of my other colleagues are really very interested or knowledgeable about them. So
Okay.
I don't deal with Hampton Court Palace, for example, but my colleague, who's my equivalent number there, is not as skilled in identifying roofs as I am. And so if a roof project comes up, or we're able to get into a roof, I'm there like a rat up a drain pipe, and they let me do that, because they understand that I'm the one who will be able to say the most about that.
Mm.
And we've recently had a project at Hampton Court. If you go to Hampton Court as a visitor, there's an area which is used as a coffee shop called the Privy Kitchen, and it's one of the few roofs in the palace. It's got a flat ceiling, so you can't see anything, and there's a sort of, I don't know how many feet, it must be 30 feet up. There's a tiny little hatch, and every time I've gone in that room for the last 20 years, I thought, oh, I want to go in that roof one day, but it's just too difficult to get a ladder up there. And so it's one of the very few roofs I've never been in. Well, recently we had a little project to do some repairs in there, and a scaffold went up, and suddenly the roof hatch was accessible. So I was quite strongly advocating we should go out there and do some, have a look at it and do some measured drawings, and we did, and it was like the culmination of all those years of longing, finally getting through that roof hatch and looking at that roof, and it was really worth it. It was a fabulous roof, and we got Dan Miles to come and do some tree ring dating on it. So, and we got a date. So it was just one of those wonderful little projects. Now I have to go and write that up, and I don't know where I'm going to find the time to do that. But I feel like I've learned all this new information, and I really should write it up so that people know about it.
Yeah. And then at the time, what was the date of the tree ring dating? What was
Tree
the
ring
date?
came out at spring 1568.
Oh.
Yeah,
And was it local timber?
Surrey, we think. So not far
Sorry.
away from Hampton Court. Yeah,
Yeah, not far at
yeah,
all.
yeah.
And
Another
then,
project. Another project I've been doing is the vault, the timber vault over the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court as well. And we know that the timber there was taken from near Reading and brought up the Thames on barges. So that's fascinating. There are all these sort of anecdotal stories. And then when I began to delve into the records, the original accounts at the National Archives for that vault, I found page after page which tells me the names of all carpenters who were working on that roof. And suddenly all these anonymous people from the 16th century come back to life. And for me, that's one of the great connections that you can make between the physical fabric and the people who made it all those centuries ago.
Yeah, that absolutely fascinates me because
Yeah,
you want to be a fly on the wall, don't you? Back in, early 1600s. And, you want to understand the working conditions and the skill
yeah.
of the craftsman, and all that's lost. A lot of that is just lost,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
we're very lucky at Palaces that we do have really good records on the whole, not for everything,
Yeah.
but we've got records for some of our buildings that you could only dream about, with knowing how much carpenters are being paid by the day in 1535. And very often they're mostly anonymous people. We've got their names, but we know very little about them. But you can work out that that there are family members, there are brothers or fathers and sons working on a project. And once in a blue moon, you can trace these carpenters doing work in other buildings, and sometimes they do emerge into the light, and you get a bit more information about them. But yeah, it's a wonderful thing that fills in that gap in the record of buildings,
Mm,
which we very rarely see, which is the people who actually made them.
it's amazing. If you had the choice, this is going to be a hard question for you. If you had the choice, give me the two sort of main topics that you would choose over, from the carpentry to the wallpaper to the interior design to the timber framing. If you had to do that now,
In what sense do you mean?
your most favorite, if you had to choose two and only two.
I think interior design, because it's so
Ah,
multifaceted and tells you so much. Well, it's very uh, it's very precise. You can tell the period of a house, and just from elements of interior design, the way
mm,
that our living environment has changed over the centuries. It's it's something that I just get more and more interested in, and that's looking at floor surfaces, furniture, paint surfaces, wallpaper, lighting. All those aspects are all combined together to create your living environment, and that has changed with technology, with wealth, all sorts of things. It's
mm,
a real barometer of human development.
yeah. That's one of my favorite things as well. I just absolutely love to do the little paint scrape on the bottom of an architrave and see what paint scheme they had in 1750. Things like
That's right.
that. I just
Yeah,
love that. I found mustard yellow. Coleman, it was absolutely identical to Coleman's mustard the other day in a
yeah.
house.
Yeah, and it confounds your expectations about how people lived in the past. That they did live with color, that they had similar colors that did to us. That people always have this idea that our ancestors lived a specific way, but when you look at their living environment, you realize they weren't too different from us after all.
Yeah, yeah. Now, when we worked together on the second project that we did at Kensington, and I remember we discovered what we believed to be, and we do think it is, the wren pine flooring that was all
Mm,
chopped up in the floor joists, and then
mm,
the cockle shells as well.
mm,
And that was absolutely fascinating, wasn't it? And we
mm.
think that the Victorians, when they revamped the palace in the 1890s, that just ripped up all the wren, beautiful wren pine flooring because it was old fashioned, and stuffed it in the
Yeah.
joists. But
It's possible. It's possible because I mean, they were all boards, and they looked like floorboards. They were the right size for floorboards,
yeah,
and they had been put back down under the later floorboards as a sort of packing,
yes,
almost like an insulation packing.
yeah,
Then, as you mentioned, we also discovered a couple of cockle shells, and at Kensington we can go back to have the building accounts for Kensington, but what we do have is a fantastic volume in the National Archives of the payments made to all the workmen. So what that tells us is just as good, because it tells us that Mr. William Beach was paid to provide so many hinges and so many locks for the doors, and this is how much and where he was providing them for. So it would say in this room and that room and that room. And one of the accounts says that, I forget the name of the tradesman actually, but he was paid for going to the seaside and gathering up cockle shells and bringing them for packing under the floorboards. And what I loved is where we found one really good example. They've been cleared out, unfortunately, but there's one room at Kensington where we took the floor up back in 2010, and it was full of cockle shells with there's pebbles as well. There were pebbles in it, and I thought, they've just scraped it up off the beach. They've gone down to
Yeah.
Southend or somewhere, and they've just shoveled it all into carts and brought it into the palace. And one of the things that always makes me smile about that experience was, these cockle shells were sort of filthy dirty. They're full of wood chippings, and think of all the dross from skin and clothing that's gone under the floors, and
Oh, yeah.
it's unspeakable. But I insisted that when they cleared out the cockle shells to put servicing in, that they put them all into bags, and then they had to put them all back again. And the workmen, the modern workmen, just couldn't understand why I was doing this.
Yeah.
And I said, you've no idea how this is an important aspect. And I had a handful of cockle shells, and I said, these cockle shells are 300 years old.
Yeah.
If that didn't move them, I don't know what would. But that things like that, maybe in the past, I think, had there been no curator, the builders would, or the men doing the work, would have just thrown that away.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
Without a second thought. That would have just been. And indeed, throughout the palace, we can see that that's exactly what's happened. So when we do find an intact floor, we now make a case, and it's absolutely for sure that we're going to preserve it.
And was that did it had thermal properties, and also I've read that it was a fire break as well,
Yeah,
possibly.
we think it's sound. It's sound in, thermal and fire, and we think that because, of course, shells are calcium carbonate, aren't they? So they
Mm.
are inherently fire resistant. And after the fire at Hampton Court in 1986, they built a sort of piece of the flooring, because they everywhere you lift a floor at Hampton Court, there's cockle shells everywhere. They're really, really well preserved, unlike Kensington. And after the fire, of course, they opened up a lot of the floors, or a lot of the floors burned, and all these cockle shells came spilling out. So they made a model, a sort of full-size piece of flooring, and they filled it with cockle shells, and then they set fire to it. And indeed, it had really good fire-resistant properties. So I like to think they knew what they were doing, and that it was about insulation and also about fire protection.
That's lovely, isn't it? It's a shame we can't do that now. Instead of
Yeah,
spraying foam into walls and things like that.
just go and get some cockles off the beach, or
Yes.
there's a thriving industry in eating them. There must be loads of shells being produced.
I remember the workmen's faces at Kensington when they had to take those short sections of the Scots pine wren
Mm,
flooring out and number every single piece and then
mm,
stack them up at the end. And again, their faces, they were just thinking, why are we doing this?
yeah,
There's a skip outside.
yeah, yeah,
And everyone it was numbered and it went back in exactly the same place.
yeah. Well,
So,
that might have been a little bit too prescriptive, perhaps, with hindsight, but um, it just made for a good methodology. That they
yeah.
got into the habit of doing that, so everything got bundled up and taped up and set to one side very carefully, and it sort of taught them not to take anything for granted, and not to throw anything out that unless they'd asked first, because you
Yes.
just never know.
You never know. And also, some of them were cut, the joists weren't exactly even. So if you took one out of one area and tried to put it in another area, it might not fit
Ooh,
anyway.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it would have
We
been,
cleared out a roof space at Kensington a few years ago. We had quite a lot of the roof space. It's very dusty, and it's centuries of atmospheric sulfation. The smoky chimneys of London had deposited all this stuff, and it's mostly carbon. And we decided we were going to clear out one of these roof spaces, and it's not a huge roof space, but amongst all of the dust and the grime were all of these wonderful shavings, which they'd obviously the carpenters had been, planing wood right up to the last minute and making things fit. And I made them collect all of the dust. They hoovered everything. They took out something like 17 bags of dust, and it weighed about 2 tons, believe it or not. But
That's incredible.
I made them sift out all the wood shavings, and we put the wood shavings back, because for me they were part and parcel of understanding the building, and they were
Yeah,
a sort of relic of the carpenters who last were there. So we took away the dirt, but we left the wood shavings.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Coming on to my next subject about staircases, there's a wonderful staircase at Kensington, isn't there? The Queen's Staircase, and that's one of the earliest open strung staircases. Is it in
Open
the
string,
country?
yeah, yeah. You get a big. If you think about 18th and 19th century staircases, you get these things called open string stairs and closed string stairs. And on
Yeah.
an open string stair, the balusters come right down onto the tread, so you could sweep the dust off the edge of the tread if you like. With a closed string, there's a sort of upstand, and the balusters come onto those. And going back to the 17th century, all staircases were closed string. But in the late 17th, early 18th century, you get this distinction where posh staircases have this open string, and then back staircases or small or less important staircases become closed string. So you can instantly see in a house whether the staircase is the posh one or the not posh one. So that
Mm.
status is something that you weigh up. And people said, "Oh, where does the open string come from?" And I never knew this, but um, I realised that the one at Kensington, which was built by a man called Alexander Fort, who was a joiner who worked for the King's or the Queen's Works, um, which was the government department that built palaces and official buildings, that he built this staircase at Kensington in 1691, and I'd never seen one that we could securely date earlier. And this is an open string. And since that time, I've been looking for open string staircases. I've never found one earlier. So, as far as I'm concerned, that's the earliest one. And maybe Alexander Fort was the man who invented it
Oh, wow.
as a
That could
development.
be.
Yeah, I mean, there are places like National Trust property, Dereham Park in Gloucestershire, which is a fantastic late 17th century house that has open string staircases, but they're 2 or 3 years later than Kensington. So
Yeah.
if it was invented at Kensington, it caught on very quickly.
Also, the angle of the carry on that staircase is very shallow as well, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. The treads are very low, so
Yes.
they're designed to sort of glide up and down. And I think
Yeah.
it's to do with women in very big dresses, being elegant. So again, another mark of status of a staircase is how tall the treads are. And normally a tread is, I don't know, 5 or 6 inches, and these are sort of 4 inches. They're very, very shallow.
Yes.
It's a pleasurable staircase to go up and down, actually.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now, I don't know if I've made this story up in my head, but I'm sure I read that Queen Mary had a fall down the stairs, which then frightened her sister Anne when she was on the throne. And there was a winch made for her to carry her, rather than going down the stairs, to carry her down. Now, is that made up, that story?
I think so.
I thought it's a lovely idea. I think she was petrified of falling down the stairs. Because is that right? Mary did have a fall down the stairs.
No, I've never heard that.
Oh, I haven't heard that.
No,
Okay, so see,
but
maybe
but
I've dreamt that.
it might be because Queen Anne sort of got more and more infirm. She was not a well woman, and she had dropsy, which was a sort of water retention, which made getting around very difficult. And so they contrived all kinds of apparatus for her. So she used to
Ah,
drive around in a tiny little carriage, for example, so that she wouldn't have to walk. And the winch story might come from that. I think she had a
maybe.
sort of wheelchair, an early type of wheelchair to push her around as well as she became really sick. So that might be where that story comes from.
Oh, I see. See, I did remember reading that she was absolutely paranoid, and when she was starting to get very unwell,
Mm.
she was absolutely paranoid about falling down and getting ill and all sorts. Because
That's not.
she had a terrible, she had 17 miscarriages, didn't she? I think, Anne.
She did 17 or 18. She had
Yeah.
most of them were miscarriages. She had several babies prematurely, and she had one child who survived until he was 11. So she was forever pregnant throughout her married life.
Mm,
Never stopped being pregnant, and that must have really taken its toll as well. And
yes.
the emotional aspects of continually losing babies as well.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Mm.
It's interesting with staircases, isn't it? Because it also depends on the location, so the geographical location where the staircase is, because you could have, open strong staircase in London, open strong staircase 1720, for instance, but in Sussex, they're still closed strong because the fashion sort of didn't get down, or the building's not of high status. So sometimes it's difficult, isn't it, to try and put a date on a staircase,
Mm.
I find, because of that reason.
You can date staircases on aspects like the type of handrail,
Yeah.
or the shape of the balusters very often, and they're the biggest giveaway because the baluster shape evolves over years. I mean, by the time you get into the Victorian period, it's like all the stops are off, and they're making weird and wonderful staircases. But on the whole, in the 18th and early 19th century, you can date a staircase quite closely from the shape and the thinness of the balusters.
Mm.
Yeah, but again, like you say, there are regional differences and there's lag as well. So something which might be 1710 in London might be 1740 in West Wales. So you've got to be really careful not to apply the standards of one area to another.
I did a survey on the Hogarth stairs at St Bart's, and that was 1735.
Yeah.
But for the time, it was quite old fashioned. I think it's close string, very,
Mm.
very chunky, almost sort of 1680s, 1700 in design. And what was interesting with that, Lee, is I did a bit of research and we found that there was a red, a pigmented varnish on that stairs.
Mm.
And we found red pigmented varnish on a door as well. And
Mm.
I just think that it's quite possible. The mahoganies were very fashionable, weren't they, in the 1730s? Everybody wanted mahogany. And I'm wondering if they actually built this staircase out of oak and then, did a sort of a fake grain to turn it into mahogany. I don't know, but it'd be a very
Yeah.
unusual thing because normally it'd be softwood, wouldn't it, if they tried to fake grain?
Yeah, yeah, and at Kew Palace, we've got a staircase there of 1728, which is entirely of softwood. So the main staircase is painted, but they always grained the handrail to look like mahogany. So there you've got graining, and there's a long history of graining a handrail to look like a more expensive wood,
Mm,
because proper mahogany staircases are really really rare. I mean, they were so expensive, that you either had mahogany veneered doors, for example, because very few people could afford solid mahogany doors. So you veneered,
mm,
but you can't veneer a staircase. So they would just paint or grain it. And
yeah.
there are accounts at Hampton Court, for example, which talk about um, painting paneling in what they call walnut tree, which seems to be, well, like either a walnut graining or a varnish of some kind, and it helps us in the record to distinguish between the oak paneling that you get in the very high status areas, and then perhaps softwood paneling elsewhere that was in some way treated to look more expensive.
Mm. And sometimes in the early 1700s, they had this bizarre marbling type of
Mm.
faux marbling, didn't they, on wooden panels? But it was quite almost psychedelic. Some of the patterns I've seen
Yeah,
it's quite sort of strange.
it's extraordinary, and you get staircases that are marbled as well. So
Mm,
there was a big fashion for it. We've got some marbling surviving at Kew actually, which is all fake. It's all marbled onto overmantels in some
mm,
of the rooms. But the poshest rooms, so in Kew Palace, it's the what we call the the drawing room upstairs that has the real thing. So the very high status rooms have proper marble, alabaster or touchstone, which is that black Belgian marble. But elsewhere, they were quite content to sort of fake it all up and make it look expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of it is incredible, isn't it? The work of art. It's just
Mm,
amazing.
yeah,
It's wonderful stuff.
yeah.
So my next sort of subject, and I'm fascinated with this, is the craftsmen in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And, you know, let's take London 1700. How many of those craftsmen would have been from the UK and how many would
Mm,
have been from overseas?
mm.
And what type of skill would the UK craftsman have as opposed to the European craftsman? And, was there a mix between the two? Was there a combination?
I think when you go back to the 16th century, you and even the 15th century, there was a great deal more crossover. I think so. If you, for example, go down to Devon and you go
Mm,
into churches and look at the rood screens, which divide the highly carved rood screens, which divide the nave from the chancel, or some of the pulpits in Devon, they look suspiciously continental. They look very French, and
okay.
and we know from analysis that a lot of people were coming over, like journeymen, were coming over from Brittany, working a bit in Devon, and then going back. So there was a lot of trade, a lot of correspondence between Brittany and Devon in the 15th and the 16th century. And
Mm,
then working on the royal palaces, you look through the names, because we've got the names of the carpenters. You look through the names of the carpenters, and there are quite a few which look like they've got continental names, and that's true particularly of the carvers. So there's a lot of fine carving work being done, and we know that a few of the carvers are Germans or Flemings, and they're also French carvers as well. So Henry's sort of hoovering up talent from continental Europe. Um, Other carpenters, what I found in at Kensington Palace, for example, we've got a really good list of carpenters, and one of the things that always struck me, and I've seen it earlier as well, is a number of Welsh names. So,
oh,
so you
how
find that the
interesting.
pool of carpenters they're all called Edwards, Griffiths, Owen, Ap Rice or Ap Reese or something like that. And you think there's just too many Welsh names there for it to be a coincidence. And you
Yeah.
wonder whether there is this sort of like a tribe of Welsh carpenters who kind of establish themselves in London, and then they bring people from their home counties to London to sort of train them up, and it's, as such, you've got this group of Welsh carpenters. I don't know how to sort of verify that, but it's certainly the case that all the names are Welsh.
God. And were they carpenter joiners back then, or were there separate carpenters and separate joiners?
They're mostly carpenters, but there are a few who are carpenter joiners.
Ah,
So, but then go to the early 19th century, for example, and we I've been studying the carpenters who built the banqueting house roof for John Soane in 1829 to 1830, and Soane used these pair of brothers. They were called Thomas and George Martyr, and I've become very interested in those two because they pop up everywhere and they're doing a lot of work for him. They're described in the record as carpenters, but they also make furniture for him. They
mm.
make furniture for Buckingham Palace, and they also were making architectural models as well. And I thought, well, it sort of suggests maybe that they're not just carpenters, but they're actually heading up a firm of people who have got lots of different talents. That they're not the ones perhaps making the furniture. And then Thomas Martyr, when Thomas Martyr dies in 1852, he describes himself as an architect, and I thought, oh, that's quite interesting how these
Yeah.
guys started off as just carpenters, but by the end of their lives, they thought of themselves as far more diverse and much more than that. So I think there's a whole realm of study looking at at these men and very often women as well who were building these things, bricklayers and masons and carpenters and joiners.
Yeah, I didn't realize, I've only just learned actually that there were a lot of women involved as well. One would think that it's just men doing this, but there were women as well.
There are women. It's a bit more complicated because very often the women take on the businesses of their dead husbands, if you
That's
like.
right.
So,
Yeah.
so often, if you have a female tradesperson, so maybe a glazier or the plumber who did the lead work at the Great Pagoda at Kew was a woman, and I think she was the glazier as well. And if you trace back her history a little bit, you find that she was married to a plumber, and he was the sort of tradesperson. And then when he dies, she's taken on the business. So she's not a sort of hands-on plumber, doing the lead work herself. She's the head of a business, and
I see.
that's what we always have to think of, is that often they're businesses, and the person in the record is not the person who's done the work, but rather the head of the business. That's certainly true for the 18th century. But Richard Hewlings, who is retired now but worked for what was English Heritage for a long time, he did a big study of these tradespeople, and he said it was 1% statistically that he found in
Okay.
the record. So very small, but nevertheless they do crop up.
And what about, are there any records of children working?
It's hard to say because often they don't give you an age, but
No.
you can sometimes see that they're working with apprentices. So the carpenters working on the chapel vault at Hampton Court in 1535. They're all up the river at Sonning, in a framing yard, and there are several of them who are called prentice. So that one imagines they're 13, 14-year-old boys. But otherwise, no. The idea of sort of child labour doesn't really come through the documents that much.
And what a lot of people don't realize is that by the time you were 25, you were such a highly skilled craftsman, but you probably started at maybe 12, 13 years old. So
Yeah,
therefore you had, now we start at 18.
yeah.
So they were advanced in that way because they just had so many more years under their
Right.
belts.
Yeah, and the apprentice system as well, of course, where you trained for 7 years or whatever under your master,
Yeah.
and then you became a journeyman. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating aspect, and one just so tantalizing because they flash into the light on these projects and then they vanish and you never really hear of them again, which is a great tragedy.
Mm, mm.
These
And
whole armies of people.
what do you think the conditions were like? It obviously varied, but I always wonder in winter and the lighting and just the work conditions. It must have been quite tough.
I would imagine. We know that when they're hurrying to build palaces, because often kings and queens want things done straight away, you get records which talk about extra fires, and that's for things like drying out the plaster, for example, but
Mm,
also extra candles because they're working long into the evening. But I don't get the feeling like life was particularly hard. Things like disease and shortness of life were big considerations. But I think that their trade was fairly well respected. But one of the things which is a great contrast to today, and which I talk about when I'm sort of talking about craftspeople in the past, is that in the past uh, the labor was cheap and materials were expensive, whereas
mm.
today labor is expensive and materials are cheap.
Yeah,
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 and that's
I know.
that's one of the big contrasts with the old and the new, I think, which I find
Mm,
very interesting.
yes, yeah, yeah. But it just must have the amount of candles or they had tallow lamps as well, didn't they? And
Yeah,
just the
yeah.
amount of candles they'd have to light to just see what they're doing. It's luxury now. We can get an LED light and just
Mm,
point it in a
mm.
corner and work. But then it must have been very
Well,
difficult.
we've done some experiments with light. We did a big lighting test at Kensington about 10 years ago, and for years we've been thinking how did these rooms look when they were lit by candles? Because of course we're used to going into rooms that are absolutely blasted by light, and our eyes are not accustomed to low levels of light. So we spent about a year organizing it, because obviously lighting a candle in a historic interior is not something you just take lightly. And we had to
Exactly.
persuade quite a few of my colleagues to agree to it. We had to also think about the people who owned the paintings on the wall and the artworks and ask their permission as well. And everybody agreed it would be a good idea. So we had this very highly controlled evening where we relit 4 rooms at Kensington, the state rooms, with candles. So we put candles in the chandeliers, we got candelabra, and we got sconces, which are those sort of mirror backed things that hang on the walls.
Mm.
And it was incredible because everybody said, "Oh, you'll be able to see nothing." And what we found was that even with, say, 20 candles in a big room, you could see everything.
Oh,
Now,
how interesting.
you can't read because that would cause eye strain, but nevertheless, your eyes adjust and everything is visible. So it was a fairly illuminated world.
That's really interesting. So what I'm getting from that is that they basically had their eyes were just accustomed to the
Mm.
dark, and they didn't have our lights have got lazy now, haven't they? Because we just
Yeah.
used to this bright light. And if we don't have a light, we just complain we can't see. But they would have been able to.
it
Is that
helps to it helped me to understand why they'd use color in a certain way. uh,
Mm.
Now, Kensington was redecorated in 1725 by William Kent, who was a great architect and a landscape gardener and a painter, who designed buildings like Chiswick House, for example. And he used gold everywhere. There's loads of gold. It's all over the place. And you think it's all a bit garish, but actually put candles in there and it all suddenly makes sense why he was
Ah.
using gold, how he stippled it, and of course it sparkles in the low levels of light. They used silk damask on the walls, and when you put candles against that, it looks like velvet. It just makes it so incredibly rich and extravagant looking. And the choice of furniture, the choice of paintings was all governed by the light levels.
Interesting.
And I thought that to me was looking at interior design from a whole different perspective.
Yes. Yeah, that's a lost art.
It certainly is, yeah, yeah. And then, of course, after that, people who were in attendance thought it was so romantic, because it was fantastic watching these rooms being relit with candlelight, and they all said, "Oh, can we do it again? Next month?"
Yeah.
We said, "No, you can't." But actually, I was last year. I was in the city of Graz in Austria, and there's a castle there called Schloss Eggenberg, and the curator, who was part of the discussions about light that we've been having for many years, decided that they were going to relight all of their historic rooms there for one night, I think a month in the summer. They relight all candles, so all the chandeliers are relit with candles, and they have special tours, and the place is just magical. It's just
Oh.
incredible. It's something that we should probably do more of here, because people really sort of appreciated the historic spaces with all hundreds and hundreds of candles lit.
Um, we had one of those storms. We had a power cut, and our village was taken out for about 4 days with electric. And it was wonderful, actually, because every evening you just light the candles.
Mm,
And what I found was that you started getting tired quite early. And
mm,
one day I looked at the clock and I thought, God, it's got to be about 10:30. And it was something like 7:30 or 8 o'clock.
mm,
But
mm,
literally the candlelight was just so lovely, and it sort of set your circadian rhythm. And
mm,
I thought, my goodness, that's probably, what used to happen. And we just slow down and really have a lovely sort of calm
mm.
evening, and then go to bed early
Go to
and
bed.
get up
Go to
early.
bed and make children.
Yeah, yeah,
But
exactly.
there's something really primeval about candlelight and naked flame. I mean, your fires in a grate and things like that. Why do we all love that so much?
I
I think
know
it
it.
goes
I
it
know.
it goes right back to our primeval origin.
I agree. I agree, because you can just stare at an open fire, a flame, and you realize you've been staring at it for,
Mm,
10, 15 seconds. And
mm.
you think, why was I just staring at that?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's an incredible thing, and of course we've lost it because few people are lucky enough to have open fires now. We might burn the odd scented candle, but we certainly don't illuminate our houses that way now.
No, no. We have a wood burner in our snug. You know, that's our TV. We don't have any TV in that room at all. And
No.
we just stare at that wood burner and it's just lovely. It's a
Yeah.
really lovely thing.
You can get lost in thought and contemplation looking at a
Yes.
fire. Mm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what about the materials that were used for these buildings? And, you know, in particular wood.
Mm.
Was there a lot of wood coming over from the continent? You know, how much wood were we using? For instance, again, whether this is true or not, but I was always told that we, up until a point, you know, the sort of 1650s, we were using a lot of oak, and then we had to go and find a substitute and go to the Baltics and
Mm.
find the Scots pine, and
Mm.
because we were needing the oak for to build ships,
Mm.
and you had to have a license to purchase oak, and it was getting incredibly expensive.
I don't know. I don't know. I think there's an element of truth in that, but the truth is when I've looked in the I've done a lot of research now on timber imports, and I think that we were importing timber in this country in the 12th century, and I
Mm.
don't think we were importing it because we didn't have our own. We were importing wood of very, very fine quality, and so in the of course, again, because you have to rely on the accounts for royal palaces survive, and but very little else. But certainly in the royal context, the kings like Henry III, for example, in the 13th century, they're importing softwood from Norway,
Mm.
and it's being used for paneling and things like that, and for window shutters. And I imagine that maybe it was thought of as slightly exotic, but what also comes through is that they import very fine quality oak from the Eastern Baltic from as early as the 13th century, and that goes all the way through. And what I've begun
Does
to
it?
appreciate, yeah, what I've begun to appreciate is when you go into churches, you look at the stall work, so the fine carved stalls and pews of churches. Very often, the oak quality of the oak is absolutely superb, and we know now from lots of documentary records, and also now with tree ring dating, that church doors, particularly, and the fine carving in churches often comes from the Baltic. So you just think, oh, it's English oak, but it isn't. It's been grown in Lithuania or somewhere like that, and it's been brought over because it was exceptional quality. You know, the grain was beautiful. These were primeval forests where the oaks grew tall without side branches, so you get absolutely um, wonderful timber, and it's imported in something which are called estrich boards. So these estrich seems to be a word which means the Eastern Baltic. So it's coming in as boarding. So what we don't get in the early period is any structural timber. So not anything like roofs or floors or floorboards seem to be made from English material, from English oak. But anything you wanted to be much finer, like a really good door or a piece of carving, you would use an estrich board coming from the Baltic.
Mm.
So I've been sort of delving into this now with some research that I've been doing recently, and then thinking also, by the time you get to the 18th century, and certainly by the time Christopher Wren is building the royal palaces, they're beginning to import softwood for structural timber. So most of the roof structures at Hampton Court are made from pine, which is imported from Sweden, I think.
Mm.
And we haven't done very much tree ring dating to establish that, but we did actually we did do some tree ring dating at the Orangery at Kensington a couple of years ago, and that was built in 1705, and that proved that the roof structure was from Sweden.
Okay.
So I've been looking in the record and trying to establish when that began. When did they begin to bring in big pieces of timber for roofs and things like that? And so far as we know, it begins in about 1630,
That's
somewhere around that time.
1630.
About 1630. Before then, they're still using English oak, I think.
Because I also was told once that our English oak was quite gnarly and it wasn't always best for furniture making. So a
Mm,
lot of the early English coffers you see could have been oak from France, where they have,
yeah,
you know, straighter grained, taller
yeah,
trees.
Yeah.
So again, whether there's any truth in that, I don't know.
There's been a project looking at coffers. Dan Miles has been who some of you people may have heard of, who is a tree ring specialist, and he's dated a lot of coffers in church, particularly churches, and he's finding that a lot of them are Baltic. So I think that,
Baltic.
yeah, it's Baltic. So it's coming from modern Poland, Eastern Baltic, modern Poland, Germany, and the Baltic republics and
And it's
Finland.
Quercus robur.
It's Quercus robur, but of course the conditions of growth, very slow grown, very straight grained, no side branches, so you don't get knots or anything like that. And it's prized for its quality. This is becoming. It's only in the last few years that we've really begun to try and tree ring date church doors, for example. And lo and behold, Baltic. We've got a door, a 15th century door in the Tower of London, and it's down in the basement of the White Tower. It's this big sort of strong door. We had it tree ring dated Baltic. So these are real revelations for us, I think. It's really interesting. So now when I go into a church, I look at the oak and I think I can't trust any of this now. It's probably all Baltic. But I think it's a really interesting aspect of building and working with wood from the late Middle Ages onwards.
And they really knew their stuff then, didn't they? They knew that if they brought timber in from the Baltics, not only was it, it was straighter grain, but because of it was slow grown because they had harsher winters there. And so therefore they were sort of the SAS of the tree world, weren't they? Those the timber they brought in, and they just knew that was structurally a much better option to bring
Yeah,
that in.
and I think there's also local climatic conditions as well, which influence the growth of oak. So if you're a tree ring specialist and you're looking at where the timber comes from, one part of England which has been very difficult to date because the oak is so strange is Suffolk. So
Oh,
they have great difficulty in dating oak because there's something about the local climatic conditions in Suffolk which makes the oak grow in an erratic way that's not as easily diagnosable as, say, oak grown in Surrey or in Berkshire or something like.
how strange.
Yeah, and they don't quite know why. They think it might be geology and microclimate. But it's a bit like if you were to grow oaks on a 20-acre farm, you probably find that on one side of the field the oaks grow really well and on the other they don't, and nobody
Yeah.
quite understands why. And I'm sure you can extrapolate that into the wider environment. But certainly from in the Baltic, you've got these vast forests which have been there since prehistoric times. They're
Yeah.
not planted; they're just natural oak forests from the primeval. They still survive. Some of it's still there, with these enormous, great primeval forests. And the same is true of pine in places like Sweden. Sweden is still today the most forested country in Europe, and it's got incredible timber resources, with these 300-year-old pines growing in forests, very tall, very straight.
Yes. I've got so a colleague friend of mine is coming on the show next week, and he's a Swedish carpenter and
Mm,
very, very knowledgeable about the slow grown pine, and he
mm,
uses it and he uses the adze and the axe and
mm,
that type of thing. So I'm going to quiz him about
mm.
the techniques of how they used to cut the trees down and the drying process and the converting the timber as well. We're going to be discussing that. So
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah,
it'd be lovely. And I really would love to actually see a piece of, say, the Baltic Scots pine now, and a freshly cut piece of wood that resembles the type of quality that Wren
mm,
was installing and making buildings out of. Because
yeah.
you just don't see it in this country at all, do you? It's absolute
No,
rubbish.
it's all close. It's the early stuff is close grained, but also apparently there were fashions in the way that the log was converted depending on the market. So the English liked their logs to be square bulks of timber,
Ah.
whereas the French wanted logs in the round, and the Dutch liked their logs to be squared off with beveled edges. So there are all sorts of weird weird reflections of local sort of taste, if you like. But in the 19th century, I've done some research on the timber trade from the Baltics. Is that they're starting to open up the great forests of the interior in places like Poland, for example, and Sweden sort of dries up as a source of good timber because of the Napoleonic Wars and of the blockades and things like that. And they chop these trees down, and then they would, in the winter, the dead of winter, they'd square them off, and then they'd lash hundreds of these bulks of timber into great rafts, and then they float them down the rivers for 2 years, 1,000 miles sometimes, till they get to the ports, and then they're bought by English merchants. So when you go into roofs of the 19th century, you can often see a sawn face on the timber, and then the other three faces will be adzed. And not only that, but those three adzed faces will be weathered where they've been in a river for 2 years. And that's still there on the timber. So
Oh, that's incredible.
you still get the story of how that timber was converted from a tree and the process that it took down the rivers till finally it made its way to a saw pit, and it was, sawn up into the requisite shapes and was sold on to go in our buildings. And that's what, like, proper archaeological evidence for me.
Mm. And as a rule, did the imports from the Baltics and Sweden come in as, like you say, in just a big square lump, and then it was converted in this country before it was then put into flooring?
Not always, no,
Ah,
because certainly in the late 18th and the early 19th century, we liked to buy. Well, the Swedes would sell their timber sawn, so we would buy boards from Sweden and bulks from the Baltic. So again,
ah,
depending where you got your timber from, and one of the reasons was that the Swedes were very early at developing water-driven sawmills. So we were
yes.
almost Luddites. We were still, two men in a saw pit. But the Swedes had these incredible early hydraulic powered sawmills going. So they would take their timber down to the fjords, and then they would convert it all into boards, and then it would be shipped as boards over to England. So again,
Wow.
it's not straightforward. There's a complexity to the story, whether it's from timber from Norway or Finland or from Riga or wherever. I think that there are nuances to do with the production of timber, and then we see that somehow as a reflection in the buildings when we look closely at them.
Mm. Those remnants of the flooring that we found at Kensington, they were such different thicknesses, weren't they? And even one board from one side to the other
Mm.
was just, it was an inch and a half one side, and then, an inch the other. It was
Mm.
it's such difference. And they used I can't remember what the tool's called, Lee. It's a special sort of rebate plane to get the
Mm.
edges the same width. So
Mm. Mm.
therefore, they knew that then they could add to
Mm.
those edges, couldn't they? And then place them on the joist, and they'd be all level.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
It is
I love
wondrous
seeing
to
that.
see. I mean, seeing today guys working with side axes, with adzing, it was just incredible. It's so time consuming. And you think these people must have been toiling for weeks and weeks and weeks to create the things that we take for granted in our historic
Yeah,
buildings. And the
yeah.
finesse of it too. You get ads marks on things, and they're almost indistinguishable from sanded timber that we would get today, because they were so skilled at creating a flat surface with a side axe. Who could do that now? Nobody.
No, I know it's incredible, and I'm also fascinated about the moisture content of the timber when it was worked as well, because it makes a difference.
Mm.
How wet it was or how dry it was. Yeah, it's all these things we don't quite know.
Well, with structural timber, of course, what the tree ring guys will tell us is that they always use the timber green, and that it was, cut down that spring, and by the summer it was in the building.
Mm.
Furniture must have been slightly different, and there is now evidence that sometimes they draw from stockpiles. So the Orangery at Kensington is an absolutely securely dated building, which is 1705, but some of the pine in the roof has dated 1682, which means that timber was hanging around somewhere for 20
Ah,
years before it was used.
Yeah.
So it would have been fairly, absolutely seasoned by the time it was worked.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Can we just talk about a little bit about wallpapers? Because it's another thing that I absolutely am fascinated with wallpapers and discovering
Mm,
wallpapers because, a lot of the time we will discover wallpaper because we'll take a panel and an elevation off, and then you'll find that there was, wallpaper behind or something like that. So
mm.
when did it sort of really start in the UK, would you say?
There are surviving wallpapers from the 16th century.
Is
I
there?
think the earliest piece of wallpaper came from Hampton Court. It was discovered in the 19th century. But I suppose patterned wallpapers come in the 18th.
Right.
And they were so expensive at the beginning that when you moved house, you took your wallpapers with you. So
How?
you
How'd you do that?
well, the way that they were nailed up, or the early wallpapers are nailed onto sacking or hessian, hessian,
Ah, I see.
stretched canvas, and so you were able to unpick it, and take it with you. And we do have a few examples of people either saying, "I'm buying this house, and you need to leave the wallpapers," or "I'm taking the wallpapers with me." It wasn't commonly done, but they were very expensive things to put up, and they were prestigious as well. So again, the number of the colors, the patterns, all of those things are really important indicators of date. And you can often see the nail holes and tiny traces of fiber where you would have had wallpapers and they've disappeared.
And
There's
what
a
what was the
wallpaper history
technique?
society.
Oh,
Are you
really?
are you a member?
No, I'm
Oh, you
not.
should join.
I love it. I
It's
love wallpapers and paints.
yeah.
You said earlier what sort of drew you, and it drew you to
Yeah.
historic buildings. That's my fascination. I'm just really, really interested in that side of things.
I have a wallpaper collection upstairs in a huge box of samples that I've taken from buildings that where the wallpapers were going to be destroyed, and so I've sort of cut a piece out
Mm,
and taken it, and a few of them I've had delaminated because they would often wallpaper over again and again over earlier layers. So you might have 10 layers of wallpaper building up on a wall over time,
mm.
and I had there's a specialist called Alison McDermott who manufactures wallpapers in a traditional way, and she got one of her students to delaminate one of these wallpaper samples for me very kindly, and we found I think 6 layers, and every single example was a really important, never before seen pattern
Mm.
that showed us 18th and 19th, the sequence through to the 19th century. It was really a real revelation for me.
How do you go about dating wallpapers? Were the early wallpapers just hand painted or sort of block printed?
Yeah,
And then a machine, sort of more machine made, obviously, as we go through into the Victorian
yeah,
period.
they're all block printed. They're block printed right until the 19th century, and even today, you still get block printed wallpapers. So the old companies like Cole and Son, who are still going, will still make. I mean, flock wallpaper, for example, can't be made by machine. It has to be done by hand because it's so specialized. And you can date them based upon the inks and the colors that were used, and the patterns, really the style of the patterns. So you get things like dot wallpaper, for example, where the background is lots of little dots, and that's typical of a sort of Regency period wallpaper. So if you have,
Okay.
forget what it's called something like paper and dot or something, and if you get that, you've got a Regency paper or sprig wallpaper with little tiny flowers, that sort of thing. So you can categorize them according to specific styles. But I mean, there are people who know far more about it than I do. But I can kind of generally identify a wallpaper. Occasionally, you get wallpapers. I uncovered a wallpaper years ago in a house in Hertfordshire, and it was bright green. And I thought, oh, this is pretty. But somewhere at the back of my mind, I remembered somebody telling me that bright green wallpaper was made with arsenic.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah. And so I was
that's
very
right.
careful. I removed a tiny sample, put it straight into a Ziploc bag, and I've never opened it since because I think it's probably, lethal. But it only survived behind a skirting board, which is often where these historic wallpapers do survive.
Mm.
Take off a skirting board and you usually find a piece of wallpaper.
Our previous house, it dated to 1840, and when we were working on it, I discovered that there was a sort of a darkish green paint, and it had a sort of black stenciling in the corner, like a floral
Ooh,
stencil.
yeah.
And I'm sure that possibly could have been arsenic, that produced that color.
What wallpapers succeed, of course, are wall paintings. And sometimes wall paintings look like wallpapers. So you've got these sort of all over patterns that would fill your wall, which in turn were designed often to look like textile hangings. And so you sometimes have wall paintings that look like curtains, but not the real thing. And those wall hangings go back to goodness knows when, to the Anglo-Saxon period. So
Yeah.
you have, where you can afford it, you have textile hangings on your walls, not necessarily tapestries, but painted cloths and things like that, and that eventually becomes wallpaper.
Mm. Is there one particular book that you would recommend for people
I've
interested
got
in historic wallpaper?
I'm looking up at my bookshelves here, and I've got about a dozen books, and they are all the books that you can get on wallpapers, believe it or not.
Okay.
It depends. There's a few sort of general history books on wallpaper, which are quite useful. And then the Wallpaper History Society issues a sort of annual magazine, which is also full of interesting stuff, new discoveries, that kind of thing.
Mm. Just moving on, just very briefly on to carpets and rugs.
Mm.
And when did the sort of wall-to-wall carpets start coming in?
They come in the early 19th century, so
Okay.
about 1805, something like that, maybe slightly earlier, 1790s. Um, we when we redecorated Kew Palace, we had wall to wall carpets put in uh, of a pattern that was around in 1805, but that was based on accounts which we have for the refurbishment of the palace for George III, which talks about Brussels and you have Brussels, Kidderminster, and Wilton, depending on the pile and the knotting and that kind of thing. And we knew that they were wall to wall carpets, and people are quite astonished when they come into the house and say, "Surely this isn't historic," because they remember
Mm.
their granny having a big rug in the middle of the room. But indeed, wall to wall carpets originate at that time. But there's a plethora of things um, to do with rugs. I mean, you have sort of painted oilcloths or flat weave rugs. So rugs themselves come in all sorts of varieties depending on the status of the building that they're going in. And even before that, you've got sort of woven sort of like fibrous rugs, which in the Tudor period were very common, easily disposable, but covered the floor. But you would get food and things on it and splashes, and you'd need to chuck it away and get new stuff. So there's a huge and equally complicated history of floor coverings as there are
Mm.
wall coverings.
And the wall-to-wall carpets, so they started around the early 1800s.
Mm.
But I suppose, your average modest house wouldn't have had wall-to-wall carpets at that time, and that would have been later, because you see the typical either a painted edge round flooring, or sometimes it's a dark sort of bitumen base cover that they put, where they've obviously had a rug, about 2 foot from the wall, haven't they? So
Right, yeah.
so it was still very expensive to have wall-to-wall carpets in the
It
Victorian time.
it was. I don't. I mean, I think we're looking at royal at the sort of top of the spectrum at the royal family, but I would imagine you don't get proper wall-to-wall carpets until in the 1920s or 30s or something like that. But
Mm.
one interesting thing, you do have painted oilcloths. Oilcloths are very rare, but you basically have a pattern on a kind of impregnated textile with linseed or something like that. And what the oilcloth develops into in the 19th century is linoleum,
Yes, yeah,
which
of
is
course.
itself just an oilcloth. So you look at the back of early lino, and it's a kind of open weave canvas that's then had lots of layers of paint and things put on top of it. So
Mm.
linoleum, which of course is a kind of hygienic floor covering, begins life as an oilcloth, and an oilcloth is designed as a hard wearing, easily cleanable, but and yet nicely patterned floor covering.
Mm.
There's a whole world out there, and there's no linoleum society, but I think lino is really interesting. I have a piece of 19th century lino in my collection, which I
Do
think
you really?
I do. I think it's very, very rare, and it's patterned with chrysanthemum blossoms, so it looks like a really rich carpet until you step on it, of course. So they were very highly patterned, but so rare now because of course people just chuck that stuff away.
Mm. Unless you're
Even
Charles Brooking.
Charles Brooking is the exception. He's the great kind of savior of a lot of these sorts of things. But
Yeah.
even if I see 1940s and 50s things, I will still take samples of them because I think it's easy to throw away something that's only 50 years old, and yet in time it will become perhaps equally as important.
Yes. Actually, I've been working on a building 1958, and it's very much in the sort of cross between deco and 50s style
Mm,
furniture. And I was trying to explain to somebody on site that, although it's not to a lot of people very historically significant, these pieces, they will be. So they've got to
yeah.
be really looked after now, because
Mm,
in 50 years' time, they'll be incredibly important. So it's just trying to educate people, isn't it? That the
yeah.
stuff from the 1920s and 30s that gets looked over now,
Yeah.
it shouldn't do.
Admittedly, we've got lots more information on that period
Yeah.
because people have been collecting pattern books and all sorts of things since the 19th century. It's really the earlier stuff where we've got lots of new discoveries to make. But even so, I like to apply the same rationale to things that I'm looking at or removing in buildings from the 50s as I would from the 1750s.
Mhm. Just moving on quickly to the sort of heating and lighting, because again, I'm quite interested in how these buildings were heated, with open fires. I mean, some of them probably had some swanky water-based sort of systems in the early days, but the buildings, obviously, the heat was far more gentle than obviously it is now over central heating, which is obviously, as you know, done a lot of damage to some historic joinery.
Mm.
But what was the heating sort of going on from the open fire? What was the next stage really in the evolution of heating a building?
What we've got a good example of that is at Kensington Palace, where we have in the early 19th century, so at the time when, because Queen Victoria was born at Kensington Palace only because her father had been given an apartment there in 1798, and he spent years refurbishing it and sort of getting it up to a standard that he wanted. And what he did there was he installed stoves. So we're looking at stoves where you are burning, but you're burning inside an enclosed environment, a bit like they have on the continent, where the idea of the open fire is much more alien on the continent, and they adopted stoves in the 17th and 18th century. Yeah,
Did they?
big ceramic stoves. Yeah,
Uh,
and what the Duke of Kent had at Kensington was underfloor sort of hot air heating. So there was a furnace somewhere that directed hot air under all of his stone floors. So he had this sort of ambient heat coming through. And I think he was really interested in modern gadgets. He was a kind of forward looking man. So he contrived this incredible heating system. And we know he had very, very few open fires, and it was nearly always stoves,
wow.
which for England was a bit of an innovation because we don't really go in for stoves in the 18th century. And I've never understood why, because if you go to France and Germany and Austria, they never had open fires in the 18th century. They only had stoves. They're just as efficient. They don't make your room dusty. They don't cause fires. But we didn't adopt it. Then in
Isn't
the
it
19th,
strange?
yeah, yeah.
Because the Romans had quite sophisticated heating, underfloor heating systems. So why didn't we? It took that
Well,
long.
that technology gets lost, but we do know that in the Middle Ages here there were stoves. So we found what you'd have. It's something you find on the continent, but in some English contexts also, is that you would have a kind of I can't quite describe it, but in your room, in your upstairs room, rather than have an open hearth, a chimney, you would have a kind of ceramic bulge that comes through into your room, and on the other side, a servant would be sort of feeding a fire, so that you have stoves in your room, but you don't see anybody loading them up and
Oh, I see.
if you see what I mean. And we've got a few of those as an example in at Windsor from the 14th century that's like that. And then there were charcoal burners, of course, as well, but they have all sorts of inherent risks. But you could move a charcoal burner around to provide localized heating. But the main hearth would be in a domestic house, you'd have one fire. And it's not until the 16th century that people start to put fireplaces upstairs, for example, and begin to heat the upper rooms of the house. So you
Yeah.
lived in the one room with the fire in it, and then you just took pot luck when you'd run off to bed, but you wouldn't have much heating elsewhere.
Yeah. And again, I read it was a sackable offense in the big households to if you let the fire go out. And they'd have to go down the road and get some embers from the neighbour. And I think it was the passing of fire in the street was banned after the fire of London.
Yeah, they cause all sorts of problems. Yeah,
Yes, yeah. So
yeah,
it's amazing how we just relied so much on the open fires and the heating systems because it would have been winter, pretty cold. And I've even heard reports that in the summer they used to keep the fires going sort of
yeah.
quite constantly as well.
At times of what we have to remember is that over the course of centuries, you did have periods where you'd have sort of what they called little ice ages. So the late 16th century was like that, where they were very poor, very cool summers, and
Mm,
and there were crop failures and all sorts of things. But basically, you'd have 20 or 30 years of bad summers that meant that you had to keep fires burning in the summer even. And you go to you look at sort of vernacular architecture in parts of Ireland, and can talk to people even today who remembered life in the 1930s or 40s, and they said the fire was kept going all through the year. It was never put out.
yeah.
Something to do with the dampness and just the nature of some of those vernacular buildings. But it was just, and you were cooking as well. But rather than keep relighting the fire, you just kept it going all the time so that you could cook on it whenever you needed.
Yeah. And also, again, it's another thing, a bit like we were talking about the light, getting used to this amazing bright light now.
Mm,
We used to put up with much cooler temperatures and we're quite
mm,
happy. And it doesn't take you long to adjust to it. So when we moved to our house, our new house, we've been there about a year, and there wasn't any proper central heating in this house. So we had to have some central heating installed. But we were 2 or 3 months over the winter without
mm,
any heating, just the wood burner in the snug. So
mm,
we walked around in the dry robes and things like that. You know what? Now, Lee, we've got heating. It doesn't go above 16 degrees
mm,
because it's too hot for us.
mm,
Whereas our previous house, if it
mm,
was 16, we'd be saying, oh my God, put it up to
mm,
19 at least. So,
mm, mm.
that only took us 2 months to acclimatize to
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know about the modern generation. I grew up in a house without central heating. At one point, we didn't have central heating. My grandparents didn't have central heating, and we would get dressed in bed. You get a hand would come out and pull the clothes in under the covers, and you'd get dressed, and then you'd run downstairs where your grandmother had sort of turned on the oven and opened the oven door so that you could get a bit of heat. I mean, that was the long and short of it.
And then you were lucky if you got a crust of bread.
That's right. Well, no, it wasn't quite that primitive, but I certainly can remember things like that. The curtains sticking to the windows because they were frozen
Yeah,
and things
yeah,
like that. The
yeah,
inside
yeah,
of
yeah.
the windows. Yeah.
My daughter doesn't realize she's born. When I was younger, we'd go and stay at my gran. She didn't have central heating either, and we'd have to run up at night, run up into the bed, and she'd say, "Kick your legs," and you'd have to
Mm.
get into bed and just thrash around
To get yourself
for
warm. Yeah.
for about 2 minutes, and then you warmed up.
I think it makes you a bit tougher, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I quite like a cooler house. I'm not one for sitting in superheated houses. I
No.
like the house to be I mean, even today, my mother will say, "Well, put a jumper on if you're a bit cold," and she's
Yes.
right. She's
Yeah,
right.
absolutely. You're
There's,
right.
there's nothing
Definitely.
wrong with walking around the house with a jumper on, rather than
No.
a t-shirt with the house that's been too much heated.
Yes. Yeah, 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 yeah. So we're coming towards the end. I just wanted to discuss some of your sort of notable projects, and you've done some amazing work, but is there anything that comes to mind that would be sort of one of your favorites or one of your most memorable projects or the most challenging?
Without a doubt, it's the Great Pagoda at Kew. I think because it was so out left field in terms of historic buildings, and I was conscious all the time I was working on that. We finished that in 2018, and I was very conscious that I would probably never work on a Chinese pagoda again, or
Mm,
European Chinese pagoda. But it threw up all kinds of interesting challenges for us because the architect was a man called Sir William Chambers, who was George III's um, official architect, and he was trying to build something in the pagoda. He built it in 1762, and he wanted to build something that was sort of astonishing and quite out of the ordinary. And he used all sorts of experimental materials, like he used a lot of copper on it, for example.
mm,
And not many buildings have got copper on them. And the roof is copper at the Kew. And when we came to restore and repair and conserve that, it threw up all sorts of challenges because the way that they had done copper work in the 18th century is not like they would do it today. They painted the copper a sort of red lead color, a sort of dark red. Well, today you never paint copper, and we had coppersmiths working on that building, and they said, "Oh, you don't paint copper," and we said, "No, well, we have to paint it because the new copper that we're putting down, it has to be painted." Oh, we've no idea. How do you prime it? So they
mm.
learned a great deal. And we all learned a great deal, but it was technically a very challenging building, that I think, but so rewarding, to see it now back to the way it looked in the 18th century. Just it looks just stunning, and it was a terrible shadow of itself before. So I feel really proud of the pagoda, and I feel like it was a great challenge for me, but in a good way.
Mm. How long was the project? So you finished in 2018, did
Yeah,
you say?
it was about 2 years, but
Was it?
it was 2 years, but it was preceded by 10 years of research. So we had an inkling that we would get the management of the building from Kew Gardens way back when, and so we started to do all kinds of research like paint analysis, and we had architectural surveys done, your drawing surveys, and climbing into the roof and doing all sorts of things like that to inform ourselves as much as possible that when we came to restore the building, we knew what we wanted to do with it, because at the beginning we had no idea whether we would just paint, because it was all red. Would we just repaint it red? Would we take it back to an earlier color scheme? What were those earlier color schemes? Would we put the
Mm.
dragons back on it? How would we make sure that we got safe access? What needed repairing? What are the materials made of? All of these sorts of things. And actually, funnily enough, we did tree ring dating on the pine in the pagoda, and we
Mm.
couldn't get a match. So we didn't.
Oh,
We still don't know where it came from, and I suspect that it's colonial American timber.
oh, how interesting.
Yeah, that's my suspicion, but I can't be sure. Maybe one day we'll have, and that's because there aren't the sequences in America yet to
Yes.
compare it with, rather than not really knowing where it's from. But I think there's all sorts of secrets that building can still throw up.
I remember I went to see the pagoda. I think I met Rob. Was it Rob Umney?
Rob
Maybe.
Umney, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I came out and had a look at the floor. That must have been, yeah, around that time.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, like you say, it's such a unique one-off project, isn't it?
Mm.
You're not going to find another one.
No, no. And at the moment, I mentioned earlier, I'm working on the chapel vault at Hampton Court, where we did some conservation work on the reredos at the east end of the chapel, which has got loads of Grinling Gibbons carvings on it, and it's an absolute marvel of joinery and just fantastic quality stuff. And we got the scaffold up to the Tudor vault, which is all timber. You think it looks like stone. It's all painted blue with stars on it. And so I took that opportunity to do some analysis of that, and we did some paint analysis and so forth. But now what I've been doing is going behind above the vault to see the carpentry of it. The carpentry is an absolute marvel. And so what I want to do is and as I was mentioning, looking through the records as well, which are very, very good for that period. So this incredible structure of 1535, I think, has really captured my imagination, and hopefully I'm going to sort of bring that to completion in the next year or so.
Oh, that sounds incredible.
Mhm.
Well, it's been absolutely fantastic, Lee. I really appreciate your time. And you know what I think is that you don't have a job, you just have a hobby. You get paid for it.
I'm very lucky, that's for sure, to do something that I love so much, and I've never got bored with it. That's the I think if you
Whoa.
ever have a job like that, you hold on to it. One that just constantly poses you new challenges, means that you're always learning new things, and you have to have the curiosity to respond to that. But yeah, it's I mean, I'm so privileged to be able to work on these really interesting and important buildings.
Mm. And are there the youngsters coming through to, replace you when you're
Yeah,
retired?
there's some good promising people coming through who and there are good courses now at Cambridge, for example. There's a master's there which is minting out promising young people who are beginning to specialize. So maybe there will be somebody who can step into my shoes. Well, there has to be. So yeah, I
Mm.
think I think the profession is looking good.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be a lot of enthusiasm and interest,
Mm,
from young people. Compared to 20 years ago, I think there's a bit of a buzz.
mm,
There's
mm,
more of a buzz now,
yeah,
which is really, really promising.
yeah.
Well, look, Lee, thank you so much for joining us and just sharing your insights into an amazing world that you live in. And it's been an absolute pleasure to
Well,
learn from you.
I hope people find it interesting.
They will absolutely find it interesting,
Right.
100%. But before we wrap up, where can they find more about you and your work?
Well, come and visit the palaces. Kew Palace, Hampton Court Palace, the Tower of London, Kensington Palace, and soon to be reopened Banqueting House in Whitehall. So those are our main London palaces. And I do try and publish things. I'm hoping to publish an article on the Baltic timber trade in the Vernacular Architecture Journal, for example. And there are a few books out there which I've written or I've contributed to, which you can just Google me
Yeah,
and
great.
find out.
We'll make sure that we get the links for those books and
Okay.
everything to do with HRP as well. And we'll put those in the
All right.
show notes.
Yeah, great. I'll put together a little reading list if you like.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Really, it's been great. And I didn't think, when we met 14 years ago, that we would be
Mm,
speaking on a podcast.
we didn't know what podcasts were then.
Exactly. We didn't know
I don't think they even existed.
No. A pod what? A pod
What's this Zoom you talk of?
No, it's been really, really good. So thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Okay, I look forward to hearing that.
Yeah, perfect.
All right.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
cheers then. Bye bye.